as we've been doing these HMA grants, we kind of find that a lot of the sub-applicants have the same mistakes in their grants, and so it's like, well, if we can put together a training to hopefully point out some of those mistakes or some of those issues, that we can avoid those and make the process a little bit smoother, make your grants better, so that we can all get the funding. So mitigation, what it is and what it isn't. So one thing I usually do with most of my presentations is a lot of people refer to it as disaster porn. It's really good. People love to see pictures of disasters, and that makes my presentations so much better, just because then people don't really listen to me. They're just like, oh, that's a cool picture. So this one I try to maybe change it a little bit. Got some nice, boring mitigation pictures. So this is at a water district we retrofitted. They just bolted the wall and the floor joints. So I've got some more boring pictures for you in a little bit here. So mitigation, what is mitigation? It's really just any effort that you take, a permanent effort that you take to lessen the impact of a disaster. All right, so we'll have some questions here. Are these mitigation? We'll go through them. Sandbagging, is sandbagging mitigation? No. And why not?
It's not permanent.
Exactly, it's not permanent. Retention basin? Yes. Riprap on riverbanks? Rick knows this one. Acquisition of open space? So this is a trick question, because while we think it is mitigation, I truly think that's mitigation. FEMA does not currently. We're trying to change our minds. We've been pushing a project along the Weber River to the region. I think we've got region on board. Region agrees that purchasing open space prior to development is mitigation. Now we're just trying to get headquarters. And the reason why FEMA doesn't look at purchasing open space as mitigation is because they're not protecting anything currently, right? So in FEMA's mind, that whatever your mitigation project is has to actually protect built infrastructure. So if we just buy an open field where nothing's built, but we know development is going, in FEMA's mind, they look at it and say, well, what are we protecting if we buy this field? You know, the nearest building's 500 feet from the river. So that's where they're coming from, and we're saying, well, if we stop development before it happens, then we don't have to worry about protecting it later down the road. So we're still battling with them on that. Purchasing equipment and vehicles. Sorry, no fire trucks. I understand. They're like mitigation, but they're not. Removing vegetation to create defensible space. Yes. Non-structural retrofit. Does everyone know non-structural? Well, I've got an example of non-structural retrofit in the presentation. Oh, wait. Generators.
Yes.
Depends on the year, right? Like in FEMA's world, it just depends on the year. Sometimes they are. Last year and this year, or sometimes they aren't. Last year and this year they are eligible. Here's that same building, the water district. That I've just got a couple examples of some mitigation projects that we did. This is one. There's a theme to my pictures. See if you noticed the theme. So this is a non-structural retrofit that we did, and all we did was we braced all of their pipes and infrastructure, like their cooling and electrical to the walls and to the ceiling. Salt Lake Leonardo retrofit. So one of the things I thought was really cool about the Salt Lake Leonardo is they had these huge beams that had to be placed in there to complete the retrofit. And the only way they could do that is to crane them. They had to make a space for them in the wall, and then they had to use a huge crane and just drop them down. And then that's the basement. So it went all the way down into the basement where they cemented it in and then put all the rebarb and put in shear wall along there.
3 stories down.
3 stories down, yes. It was really impressive. And then here we all are looking at it like, oh, how great. No, that's an amazing project.
Yeah, it's 5 stories.
Yeah, if you ever go to the Leonardo, kind of pay attention to the bracing that they've put in. And the one thing, and I think Ember will talk about this later, is when you're doing a project, we have to take into consideration, since we're using federal funds, EHP, historic buildings. The Leonardo, it was the old Salt Lake City Library, and it wasn't 50 years when they applied for the grant, but because of the significance of the architecture, FEMA deemed it historical. So then you get a whole other process that you have to go through. Even things that you think that might not be historical, FEMA might consider historical. We had to do a historical review on a canal in Manaway because the pioneers dug it. So, for another project in our public assistance grant, there was a fence that had to have a historical review on it because it was an old fence. So just because you don't think it's historical doesn't mean it's not historical, and we'd probably have to do a review. All right, St. George Riverbank stabilization. They've done a lot of work down on both the Virgin and the Santa Clara rivers on bank stabilization. They've used FEMA funding as well as NRCS funding, as well as they've created a water service district. Is that flood control district that now gets funding from all the cities along the rivers that they can now use to not only maintain what they have, but also to apply for grants to build more, either through us or through NRCS or through their own projects. So that's what we really consider successful mitigation, is when the communities can kind of take over and come up with a lot of their own funding to fund these projects. Again, is anyone noticing the theme of my pictures? Oh, FEMA. Yes, that's it. We all stand around and we're like, yep, there's a river there. Yes. It's like when I go after a disaster, we're like, yep, it flooded. All right, this is my favorite kind of mitigation, and this one, there's really no funding, because really the cost to you for zoning and codes changes is political, right? Like that's a huge, what's the political environment in your jurisdiction? Is changing the codes and zoning even going to be able to happen? Is it feasible? You know, it doesn't cost a lot of money. Maybe getting a study might cost some funding, but the actual pushing forward of those zones and codes. So this is one that St. George has. So prior to 1999, they realized that they had an erosion problem, and so they reached out and they hired someone to do a study, and they studied the rivers through St. George to identify where those erosion zones are, and they created erosion hazard zone zoning ordinance, where, so you can see the 100-year flood is in the green, and then the EHZ is in the yellow. So after I think it was 1999 or early 2000s when they enacted the zone, they no longer allowed anyone to build within that zone. So all the houses that were there, they were there prior to the zoning change. And then in 2000, this is a picture from 2005, the first flooding that we've had in a long, long time. Happened in 2005, and they lost, I believe, 5 or 6 homes, and all of those homes were within that erosion hazard zone. So you can see that if they had enacted that sooner, hopefully maybe they wouldn't have built there and the homes would have been saved. So FEMA didn't pay for any of this, but it's just an example of something that you guys can do. FEMA does have some funding this year for, well, maybe I shouldn't talk about it. Funding this year for technical assistance for studies. So it's something that you could get paid for. All right, so now I'll go over the HMA programs grant programs, the different grants. All right, so when we talk about HMA, that's the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Programs, and there's 3 grants underneath this program. And we'll refer to them as either the non-disaster grants or the disaster grants. And we'll talk about the disaster grant first because it's not one that we're talking about today. So the disaster grant is the HMGP, which is Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. And it's only available after we've had a disaster. And then how much funding we have is based on how large that disaster is. So we could have 15% of whatever is after FEMA comes in and they just tell you, oh, you have $10 million worth of damage in your state. Well, then they'll give us 15% of $10 million for hazard mitigation. The thing we like about the HMGP is that we have more control over what applicants get funded, where the funding goes, what type of projects we fund. We still have parameters, but it's really in the state. We have a state hazard mitigation team the Schmidt, that we pull together. They all review projects. We identify which ones we feel are priority and should get funded. So the ones that we'll talk about today, the PDM and the FMA. So PDM, Pre-Disaster Mitigation Grant, and that's the one that we get most of our funding through, well, all of our funding through, and we'll go through that in a minute. It's yearly allocated by Congress, so there were a couple years where it was pretty regular. We knew it was going to open in April, close in July, we'd get funding, we'd find out who was awarded in October, and then Congress is Congress, and now we never know when it's going to open or when it's going to close or when the funding will come in. Luckily this year we know that. We have a slide on the timeline. So FMA is the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. Again, and it comes along with PDM. They come together as a package under the HMA. One thing that we'll talk about is that, and this is why we don't get FMA grants, or we don't have a lot of projects for FMA, is that they have to protect properties that have flood insurance. For some reason, a lot of people don't have flood insurance in the state of Utah, so there's not a lot of properties out there to protect. So they have, yes, not just flood insurance, they have to have NFIP flood insurance. That's a National Flood Insurance Program. Yes, thank you. We have a lot of acronyms. We've tried to spell most of them out on the side. So most of the time I don't even know what they stand for. I just know what they do. All right, so for PDM this year, and this is pretty exciting. We haven't had this much funding in PDM ever. So there's a total of $235 million. And not all of that is open. A lot of that is allocated to certain programs. But we'll get into that. So each state, so the state of Utah, we automatically, as long as we have eligible projects that are complete, we are eligible for $575,000. So when we can do that, we could have 10 projects for $40,000 or one project for $575,000. Just kind of depends on what type of projects we have come in. We try to be strategic with how we rank our projects to make sure that we can at least get that much funding coming into the state.
So when you have those projects scored and sent back to you, do you take those top scored and you see how many you can fit within that dollar amount?
Yes.
That's how you're determining that?
Yes, it is. And then if this first two, because a lot of our projects are well over this amount. So let's just say that like the first two are, over 2 million, but the third one is that amount, then we'll make the third one our number one priority, just so that we ensure. Yes. So there's $15 million set aside for tribes. So what will happen, and this is kind of talking about that already, is if tribes don't apply for $15 million worth of grants, then they'll just put that out into the competitive pool. And I don't know if the tribes have ever asked for quite that much money. And then, I would love if we could receive $37 million for the project. That'd be fantastic. I think last year we received almost 7 million worth of projects and plans, so I think we do fairly well, hopefully. So here's how the 235 million breaks out. So there's the 46.6 million set aside. That's what we talked about here for each state and the tribes. So once you take out all that funding, then there's 188.6 million, which is still way more than we've had in the last several years. Yeah, last year 90 million total. The year before that was 60, 70. There were a few years where it was about 25 million total. So to have 188 million, that's quite a bit of funding. One thing, and this is a credit to Brock Long, who's the new FEMA administrator. He's really behind mitigation. And one of the biggest complaints, especially from states like Utah, where it's a complaint, but it's not a complaint, because cross your fingers, I'm glad we don't have disasters. But for states that don't have disasters, we don't get the HMGP funding to do mitigation, so we rely fully on PDM. And so when they fund PDM at $25 million, that doesn't really give us a lot of funding. And so what they're trying to do, and I know there's some bills going through Congress, and I'm not sure where they're at and how it's looking, but I know they're trying to develop a system to where they take a percentage. So last year, let's say there was $20 billion worth of disaster funding through FEMA last year. So they're trying to take a percentage of that and put it into PDM for the next year. So if they do that, and we continue to have these large hurricanes, we should see funding levels like this hopefully in the future as well. But then you just never know. But Brock Long is pushing for mitigation, and I think that's why we see so much funding this year. So for FMA, that's the Flood Mitigation Assistance, there's 160 million. Utah, we usually do not apply for FMA, and that's, I think I've applied for 2 projects, and we didn't receive either one of those. FEMA's priority is on, well, and this is a lot of the reason is because of the NFIP participation and having properties insured with NFIP. And then FEMA is really concentrated using FMA grants on the SRL and RL properties. And so that's the severe repetitive loss and repetitive loss properties. And so those are properties that have FEMA flood insurance and have actually had damage, either 2 or more events where they've claimed damage within a 5-year period. So if they've had 2 events in 5 years worth, I can't remember, the 50% of the cost of the property, then they're repetitive loss. And then if they've had 4 or more with a lot of damage, then they're severe repetitive loss. And I don't believe we have any severe repetitive loss in the state, and we only have under 6. We could probably count them on one hand how many repetitive loss properties we have, which is good, because then that means we don't have a lot of people getting flooded, but then that just kind of leaves us out of this pot of funding. So if you do have projects that you believe will take people out of the floodplain or protect properties that have FEMA flood insurance, we'd love to apply for something in this funding, because I think there's usually funding that's left over, or it all just goes really to Florida and the Texas and the Gulf states and East Coast states. Okay. So generally, these grants are 75-25. The 25% match comes from the locals, from you guys. And that can be hard cash. You could just pay it in cash, or it can be in kind. If you have, your city crews or county crews out there working on it, all their work can go towards the match. There are some other caveats. PDM, they do have a small impoverished community where they pay a 90-10. If you have questions about that, let me know. We can look into how you are identified as a small and impoverished community. And then for FMA, if you do have a repetitive loss structures, they will go up to a 90/10. So you send us 100% of your documentation that you paid your contractors, that you've done the work, and we reimburse you 75% of that. And then that's how we show the match. All right, so are you eligible to apply? Are you a local community, state agency, special district, or a tribe? If you are, then yes. Are you willing to work with the Utah Division of Emergency Management? You'd have to work with me. we could let you work with Jan and Ember. I think they're a little bit more pleasant. Are you willing to work with FEMA? And you don't have to really work a lot with FEMA. You do most of that through us, even though there is some interaction. Yes. Do you have approved mitigation plan? Did you participate in the mitigation plan? If you don't know, talk to Eric. Is it an eligible activity? And Jana will go over the eligible activities later. And do you participate in the NFIP? I believe everyone here does. We only have a few communities that do not participate. Some things to look out for: duplication. Is this a duplication of work? Are you using other federal funds and asking for more federal funds? FEMA looks really close at this, as do we. And the match. So we were just talking about the match. The match cannot come from other federal funding sources unless it's CDBG money. Then that's a possibility. Right, so the difference, so you're either here for, I think everyone here is for a project. Is there anyone here for a planning grant? Bucky's here for a planning grant. So planning grants and project grants, basically the same, but a little different. Planning's a little easier. You don't have to do a benefit cost analysis or do an environmental review for planning, so that helps a lot. But you do have to use e-grants. Has everyone in here used e-grants? No one. Allie's used e-grants. Yes, a few of you have used e-grants. So the PDM program is you fill the grant out on e-grants. If you don't have a e-grants user account, I think we'll work through that later. And then we'll also talk about benefit cost analysis. So your project has to be beneficial. It has to have a BCA of 1 or greater. All right, so here's the process. So the application period opens, which is October 1st. The application is due to state, and I've got all the dates on the next slide, so we can go over that. The application period ends. FEMA tells us, hey, these are the grants we've selected. Then they'll send us an RFI, which is a request for information. So they'll say, we selected your grant, but we want more information, or we need more information before we can fully award it. Sometimes that's an easy process, and sometimes it's a not so easy process. Once we've worked through that, FEMA obligates the funding. Jana, Amber, and Eric show up in your office, and you sign a bunch of award letters. You do the project. We work with you doing grant management, quarterly reports, follow-ups. We'll usually conduct a few site visits, make sure things are going okay, take some pictures. You complete the project, submit, close out to the state, and any time from the grant award to submitting the closeout, you can submit reimbursements. You can submit reimbursements every month, though we would prefer not to do every month, but maybe once a quarter or twice a year. We prefer that you don't wait until the end. I know a lot of sub-applicants like to wait until the end and say, oh, here's $1.5 million worth of reimbursements we want you to go through, and can we have our money tomorrow? In your application, and I think we go through this, is you have to tell us how long you think the project's going to take. So you'll say, this project's going to take us 2 years. So it'll take 2 years. They have a period of performance, which is 3 years from the notification of selection. Once we say FEMA selected your grant, we just need more information, you have 36 months from then to complete the project. We can and have and do ask for time extensions. I believe we can still ask for 2 one-year time extensions. So we tried to avoid those just because it makes things easier, but sometimes they're unavoidable. So once you submit the closeout to us, we submit that to FEMA. FEMA closes the grant. We say, hey, your grant's closed. You have to retain the records for 3 years from that date that we say, oh, the grant's closed. You have to retain those records for 3 years, and then hopefully there's no audit. So here's the timeline. So October 1st is when the grant officially opens. It officially closes January 31st, but because we have to review, the state, we review them to make sure that they're good grants, that you have everything in there. And then we also have other people review them to score them so that we can prioritize them and rank them. We need some time. So the grants are due to us December 7th. The NOI is basically, hey, we want to do this project and we think it's going to cost this much. And it's really so that we can review it and say, is that project eligible? And if not, then we're going to say, we don't think this project's eligible, because we don't want you to go through and fill out the actual grant and then say, oh yeah, your project's not eligible. You just wasted all that time. So hopefully that's what we try to do with the NOI, is figure out what, if it's eligible or not. And then it also helps us in planning and knowing how many grants we're going to get and about how much funding we're going to be asking for. So that's why it's due to us by December 7th, but there is some flexibility. We'll be working with you between December 7th and January 31st. We'll probably send the grant back to you, asking for you to change it, fix it, add things, take things out. We'll go through what should and shouldn't be in your grant later. So once we submit it to FEMA, FEMA, I believe, said that they'll select by May. So we should know by May of next year if the grant was selected or not. And then they gave themselves until the end, I think, was it December? Yeah, they gave themselves until December 2019 to award the grants. And I think they want to award them sooner. They're just giving themselves time. We're actually still working on awarding grants from last year. So it's a process sometimes. Depends on the project. Some projects go right through. They tell us, they say, hey, especially planning projects are usually the easiest, usually. They say, hey, we've selected this grant, but we need a couple documents. We send them the documents. They say, okay, it's been obligated and we can award you within a month. And then sometimes it's a 7-8 month process. As long as they meet the criteria, we get projects. So, and it gets to a point though where we do get, so last year, we had several projects that met the criteria, but they ran out of funding, and that's why we prioritize. So, they funded our first 4 projects, and then they said, oh, we're out of money. We can't prioritize anymore. And then, it was about a month ago, they said, oh, we have more money, because other projects either dropped or something happened. They found more money, and we actually and maybe they fell out of the RFI process. So they actually funded 2 more of our projects, because they met the criteria, they just didn't have funding to fund them all.